Janet Grogan, very welcome to Crime World.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So we're going to be chatting today about I'll Be Gone in the Dark, which was written by Michelle McNamara. So first of all, I want to start by asking you why you chose this book.
Yeah, so I have been hyper-fixed on this case for years. The first time I came across it was a case file episode. And I got to, actually it was a 5-part case file episode. And I got to the end of the 5-part and it wasn't solved. And I was like, what is this? So I was raging. And then I just hyperfixed on everything. And then obviously Michelle McNamara came up because she's the one that coined Golden State Killer, the moniker. So then I looked into her, and then that's when I found that she had been writing the book at the time, but it wasn't published yet. So then finally it was published after her death, sadly. And I always wanted to read it, and so I did.
Yeah, it's a perfect time to try and read it. So what is it that has you fascinated about the Golden State Killer case? Like, I know we kind of talked about how, just before we started recording, was that like this, you got those 5 case file episodes, you got to the end, there was no answer, and then you just went and consumed every other piece of information you could about it. Is the intrigue for you the pieces, because you knew about this case, maybe like a lot, like I didn't even know about this story until after it was solved.
Yeah.
But was the intrigue for you the fact you had all this information but no answer?
100%. I was like, how is there so much evidence and nobody knows who this person is? And like there was eyewitness statements and sketches, and I know eyewitness statements aren't always the most reliable, but it bothered me that, and that's what I love about true crime. I love when it's solved. And I get great resolution when someone's caught. That's what I love about it. A lot of people kind of like mischaracterize it as you have this fascination with serial killers, but it's not. I like the justice of it. I like them being caught. So the fact that this guy was so like 50 plus rapes, 120 burglaries, like I think it's 12 murders.
13 murders.
13. Like, that's insane. And the amount of like DNA evidence that they had, I was like, this has to be solvable. And then like, there's obviously a little part of me which is absolutely delulu that thinks I could solve it, you know? Like, I could put all these pieces together. Obviously I can't, but I just needed to know everything there was to know about the case.
Yeah.
I just hyperfix on things like that.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with you. So before the Delphi killer was caught, he killed 2 teenage girls, and before he was caught, I was at the same obsessed. I needed to know every piece of information so I could mull it over in my head and try and solve the puzzle. Like for me, true crime and that kind of genre, it's not about the fascination of the gore and the blood. And I know for some people it is, but like I just love the idea of like piecing together a puzzle and like putting all the clues together and then getting an answer. And I think the great thing about serial killer, not the great thing about serial killer, but the good thing about, I suppose they're great kind of a puzzle in that sort of sense. They kind of scratch that itch for a lot of people.
Yeah.
So yeah, this book is based on the Golden State Killer. So we'll go back into a little bit about his crimes and who he was. So he had kind of various different monikers over the years. He was the Visalia ransacker from 74 to 76, East Area rapist from 76 to 79. Then he was the Night Stalker, or he later became known as the original Night Stalker after Richard Ramirez was dubbed the Night Stalker. And that was from 79 to 86. He was then dubbed Earons, which is East Area rapist, original Night Stalker, in 2001 after DNA linked those 2 people together. And it wasn't until 2018 that they announced that he was actually the Visalia ransacker as well. And then in 2013 is when he became known as the Golden State Killer by Michelle McNamara, who has written in like so much. She talks about this at the end of the book where they get these 35 boxes. They basically do a heist from a police station and get what they call the mother load, which is all these files. Like, wouldn't you just love to get your hands on something like that for a case you're intrigued in?
And this is the thing, while I was reading the book, I was like, am I Michelle McNamara? Because that's how I hyperfix on things. Now, obviously, like when I was reading the book, I was like, oh, this is her life work.
Yeah.
She poured everything into this. I know she was like a crime writer anyway, but with this book, you could tell with even the detail that she went into, that she really like woke up every day and it was all she thought about. maybe at the detriment of, she wrote about the detriment of relationships in her book and stuff. And how actually the Golden State, anybody who was investigating the Golden State Killer, normally their relationships suffered because they were so fixated on why can't we get him?
Yeah. Yeah, that is something that she did mention a lot. And I think it definitely is something that, to her detriment, she did say as well, I know she kind of foreshadowed maybe what was going to happen, but she had said that, it'll be the death of some people. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, as we'll go on to discuss, she did pass away before the book was even finished. Mm-hmm. So it's an absolute miracle we have this, because I think it would have been a crying shame had her work not been published, because not only is it so vast, but she is an incredible writer. Like, the way she's able to weave the narratives mm-hmm. of the different kind of it's almost like, and I know people say this all the time about biographies or factual books, is that, it reads like a thriller, but it genuinely does.
Yeah.
Because you're kind of in the point of view of all these different victims. That's what she does. She goes into their point of view, what their life is like, who they are, kind of what's the normal goings on. They hear somebody down the hallway, it's probably just my husband coming home for lunch. But no, there's a man who stops them in their tracks. And she's very good at doing that.
Unbelievably descriptive.
Yeah.
It was like being in the room. Obviously, when I listened to the Case File episode, the anonymous host can kind of put you in the room like that.
Yeah.
But with Michelle, it was just so vivid. You could see everything, and you could almost feel the heartbeat of the victims. And then she weaves in her own life where it kind of pulls you out of that kind of grim subject, where you see that there's a person behind this writing the story who has a real life outside of it. And it kind of gives you almost like a comic relief.
Yeah. And it's not as well, and I suppose when she pulls you out of the story of the the Golden State Killer to tell you something from her life, you kind of are like, where's she going with this? But then she'll make some amazing point, a eureka moment at the end of what she's saying, and you're like, oh yeah, no, actually, she kind of, when she pulls you in, she doesn't lose you as a reader almost.
Absolutely.
And what is it about this book? What stood out to you most about, I suppose, the case and about Michelle's writing?
The level of detail was insane. She definitely had those case files from all the jurisdictions for the level of detail that she had, what she knew about the cases. And even when she felt like she didn't have enough information, she went and found it. Mm. And it was just so meticulous in that obviously we know who he is now. If I had read that before we found out who he was, I probably would have been unresolved. But it was very there was no stone unturned. It was almost like she was the investigator herself. And I just, like I said, I think it was her life's work. I know she did sadly pass away before it was finished, but I don't think that it would have been solved without her. You know what I mean?
I can see what you mean. Yeah. She kind of brought, because obviously when she gave the moniker Golden State Killer, it kind of brought this fresh new interest in it because of, and she was speaking to other detectives. She worked with Paul Holes in this case, which is really cool. Mm-hmm. And kind of brought it back into the forefront of their minds. And I suppose even the book itself being published and the interest that was sparked around that definitely helped with them, trying to solve the case. But let's go back into the case a little bit. So he was the East Area rapist, as we said, the Visalia ransacker, and then he went on to murder. So as you can see, I think he's a very typical, almost textbook, if you want to say, serial killer, in the sense that you can see his crime started to escalate. Mm-hmm. The way that they were able to profile him in a certain way. So I think he's really interesting in that manner. Mm-hmm. But let's talk a little bit about, I suppose, how he committed his crimes and sort of the depravity that he went to.
Yeah, very, very planned. The stalking that he went through. Even, like you said, escalating from the ransacking. So obviously the Visalia ransacker was quite a prolific burglar. He scoped out where he was going. The targeting of kind of houses that went up for sale as well, or beside a house that's for sale that might not have someone beside it, so that when he did attack someone, no one could hear them scream as such. Just really depravity that I can't even comprehend. If it was a movie, you'd be like, that's so far-fetched. That would never happen.
Yeah.
It's just so insane.
Yeah. And I think that's what I'm saying. It's like, it's a perfect textbook serial killer in the sense that if this was, like, it could really be a film. And that's one thing I thought about the book as well, is that usually if you are reading like a crime novel or a thriller, you're just getting all these clues and there's all these different threads of information and you don't know what is and isn't a red herring. And the same with Michelle, obviously, when she was writing the book, she didn't know what was and wasn't a red herring. But also, you come to the end, you don't find out who the killer is till the very end of the book. And I think in this case, obviously, you don't find out who the killer is.
Yeah.
But it's kind of I think it's a great piece of work in that we got to focus on the crimes and how it all happened instead of going back to the killer all the time. That's one of the things that I really like about it, because most other books you're reading about serial killers, it's focusing on them, their life, what they grew up like, and all those other kind of things. Whereas this is really focusing on the acts that he, commits and the way he does it. And it's just, I mean, incomprehensible, like you said.
Yeah.
So he is currently 78 years old. We'll get into that a bit more. But when he was like in his 20s, as they assumed, and, he's been profiled so many times by everyone. But he just, the way he would call his victims years and years later and be like, did you remember when we played? And taunt them. I think there was one that was like 24 years afterwards. He was a peeping Tom. He, as well, I always kind of had this image of him in my head as this kind of very, very small, angry man. And there's these like incidents where he just goes up and kicks people in the face and runs off, which is kind of funny, but also it just kind of speaks to what sort of person he was, do you think?
There's just something missing completely with his wiring.
Yeah.
Like to ring someone 24 years later and categorize it as, do you remember when we played? You attacked this person, like they weren't playing, like it's just, I think he was 5'10" in height.
Yeah.
It's not small, it's average, I guess. It's not small, but did have this like attitude of the world has done me wrong or something, like the way that he would attack people and the things that he would say to them when he was attacking them. And I mean, I know so much detail about this case, but the stacking of the plates on top of male victims, and if he hears the plates moving, he's going to kill their wife. Like, it's just this psychological mind games constantly with him. Even afterwards, he's getting off on ringing people or leaving messages on their voicemails to taunt them. Like, it's...
Yeah. It is beyond anything that I've ever seen. I mean, possibly there's somebody else out there who's done similar that I don't know of. But he kind of, the way, he had this very psychological game. I suppose as well, what he used to do is he'd never take anything of value. He'd take innocuous items.
Yes.
He was found, some of these items were found strewn on roofs because he was crawling across them. And I don't know if we'll ever really get an insight into his psyche of why he operated the way he did, because, well, I don't know if it would have come out of trial. Maybe they would have had some sort of forensic psychologist. I don't know if I've seen many documentaries about this, heard lots of podcasts about it, obviously. But the way that she captures this in the book is something that I think is so incredible, that they all have this, he's like represented almost as like this ghost face, that he's just in their grasp, but not quite.
Yeah.
She has this massive list of names. She talks about this master list. She wants to invent this database full of information. And I'd love to do something like this myself. But she has this like idea for a database of information. Like, obviously in America they have access to so much more public information than we do here. Like when I was at CrimeCon in Nashville, there was a stand and they basically had a computer, and whatever the system that they were promoting, they were like, do you want to do background check on somebody? And I was like, huh? And I was like, oh, I wonder if I can put in like my name or something. And then I was like, no, well, it probably won't work because we've got GDPR in Ireland and that information is going to be available on US websites. But they literally are like, you can put anybody's name in here and find out if they have criminal record, or so anyone can just do any sort of deep research on this. Like, I think if you had a case like this in Ireland, it would be probably nearly impossible for a citizen sleuth to look at.
Yeah.
And what do you think as well of Paul Haynes, her researcher,
Yes,
and Billy Jensen finished the book for her? I think she said she got about 2/3 of the way through.
Mm-hmm.
What did you think of how they completed the story? Do you think it added to the story, or do you think it kind of took away? Obviously, it would have been great if she got to finish it, but
yeah. I mean, it didn't have the same detail. Obviously, Paul Haynes was her researcher for, I think, 7 years, something like that. So he worked alongside her for a long time. Obviously, it didn't have the same, flair that the way Michelle would have wrote it. And I think they did originally they tried to write it as if she wrote it from her notes and stuff, but they just scrapped it in the end and kind of wrote more like this is Michelle's work and it needs a resolution, so we're going to finish it. But just so you know, it's not Michelle. I think it had to be done. Did it add anything? No, but I think it had to be done. Yeah. I didn't enjoy it as much as I enjoyed the rest. Not that I enjoyed the book in that way, but I didn't enjoy the writing the same way I enjoyed her writing, I would say.
Yeah, her writing style is, and it is hard to actually try and put yourself into the shoes, because I've had to do it before, get yourself into the shoes of another writer to finish what they're, and it can be a very difficult way to step into that kind of word, especially the way the narrative that she was doing it, the way she was doing it in terms of like fact about the case, but also little tidbits about her life and little anecdotes about that. So Michelle died in 2016, as we've alluded to. And her husband, Patton Oswalt, is a comedian, and he did the epilogue, which I think was a really nice insight into Michelle's life.
I nearly bawled my eyes out reading just the way he wrote about her. You could tell that he just really respected her, not just as his wife, but as this crime writer. And it was just very emotional. And then on the audiobook, you can actually hear him read it.
Yes.
And then that's just like...
Yeah.
Because when I read it, I was like, I want to hear him. Because I saw that he read it and I was like, I want to hear him read it. And then it was very emotional.
Yeah.
And who knew her better than him, I guess.
Yeah.
And she, his passion and her, his passion for the way he speaks about her kind of gives you how much she might have been passionate about it as well.
Yeah, no, I thought that was beautiful also, because I had read it. I was actually really glad that you chose this book, because I had read it ages ago, and it was one of those books that I read at the time. I was I was working in the media and I had this interest in crime, and I read that book and I was like, maybe I can combine these two. But yeah, the way he speaks about it is so beautiful, and it is a pity. I'm so glad that we got this book, because it would have been an awful pity for all that work and her amazing mind to have gone without being published.
Yeah.
And Gillian Flynn as well did the introduction, which was, she's an amazing thriller writer, for Gone Girl, and she's done what other books has she done? Sharp Objects.
Oh, I haven't read that one.
Oh, really good book.
Check it out.
So she's a really good true crime writer or fiction writer, and she kind of spoke as well about how Michelle's writing style had influenced her. But you are like a consumer of not only crime news, but I suppose true crime in what we would call the very traditional sense, like this kind of old cold cases or cases that have been long solved. I think those are the main ones that get covered by a lot of traditional media or, in documentaries and stuff like that. What is the story or the case that piqued your interest in true crime? Because I think everyone has one.
Yeah, I come from a family that we always watched cop shows and murder mysteries and all those fiction things. And my sister and I used to stay up late and watch FBI files. I can't remember the case that got me into it, but I can mark the very first podcast that I listened to and I was like, oh my God. I had got an office job and they were like, you can have one earbud in and do your admin. So I was like, okay. And then I was like, I suppose I'll listen to a podcast. I think this was 2015 maybe. And I listened to The Disappearance of Johnny Gosch.
Yeah.
And I was like, what? And then all the theories behind it. And I didn't realize at the time, just because someone has a podcast doesn't mean it's necessarily true. Yeah. So I was like, oh my God, all these stories. So Johnny Gosch was the first true crime podcast I ever listened to, just a podcast on that. And then it just like freeballed. Then I was like listening to everything I could get my hands on.
Yeah.
But the case that always stood out to me the most was the Golden State Killer. And it was the lack of resolution. I was driven mad by it. I was on my way to record vocals in Cork for something. And I was like, oh, I'll put this one on. It's a 5-part series. It'll be great. And then I got to the end of it and I couldn't even concentrate on the session. But that's like 2017, I think it was.
It just sucked you in.
Yeah.
I'd be the same about the Zodiac Killer. I actually, even though I know it isn't solved, Case File did do a 4-parter or something about it. And I think I got to the end of part 3 and I was like, well, that's the end of the story. Maybe they're going to reveal who it is. I was convinced. I was like, no, they must have figured it out and Case File are going to be the ones to tell us who it is. I was like, no, they've definitely gotten to the end. And then I started listening to the 4th episode, like, because obviously they do 1 episode a week. So at this point I was waiting like on tenterhooks. I was like, oh my God, next week we're going to find out. But obviously it wasn't. They had just had so much detail in the story that it stretched so far. And I think that's the great thing about narrative podcasts in the sense of if you get obsessed with a case like that, you do seek out listening to every podcast about it, watching every documentary, because people have different opinions on it. People see evidence in different ways. But also, I'm like, did I miss something? Maybe something will click the next time I listen to it. Yeah. So what for you would be the one case? Now, actually, what was it, before we go into this, what was it like then for you when this was solved? I mean, I know you're a bystander who just had this huge interest in it. Like if the Zodiac Killer was solved, I would be so shook. And, and they said it was solved there about 2 years ago and we got really excited. Yeah. I was losing the head and turned out that they don't actually think it was him, the guy they got. So, and that's something Michelle actually talks about in the book, is that it's like having a first love. You're like, oh, this is the one, this is the one. Having your first suspect, you're like, this is the one. And then you get kind of slowly disappointed that it's not true.
That happens every few years with Jack the Ripper as well. The person's like, I know it's this person, and then it's not.
And the headlines blow up and everyone gets really excited, which I think is what happened with that one for the Zodiac Killer. But what was it like for you when this was solved?
I was house sitting for someone. So I wasn't in my normal environment and I was woken up at like 1 or 2 in the morning by the friend that actually had put me onto Case File.
Oh.
And he was like, they got him. And I knew exactly who he was talking about because I was so hyper-fixed on it. And I was like, what? No way. So straight on Twitter, because Twitter always knows. And then after that, I just consumed anything that Paul Holes was a part of. Then I was looking into GEDmatch stuff and Ancestry DNA and, how they caught him basically. Because I think time's up for a lot of serial killers. They're gonna get you.
Yeah.
If they have your DNA,
and that's the thing that they caught him in the end with, because Michelle did at the the last chapter or so of the book is really talking about genetic genealogy and how that is the future and how there's, the answer to who this Golden State Killer is in a DNA system somewhere and it's behind lock and key. And, they thought she was like, this will probably be the way he's found. And Paul Holes was working with Colleen Fitzpatrick.
Ah, yes.
And they were kind of talking about how they could do, like, basically go back through the family tree and find him that way. And that book was published in 2016. Mm-hmm. And 2 years later, that's exactly how he was caught. Yeah. And about 2 years ago, maybe, I interviewed Paul Holes about his book that he had just released at the time. And we talked a lot about his process and how the Golden State Killer was caught. So we'll link that episode if you want to go back and have a listen to it. And he really gets into the details of how they got him in GEDmatch. They went to his house and because obviously none of this is in the book because it didn't happen yet. But and I would actually love a second part of all that information about how he was caught and kind of maybe another profiler to come and look at him again and kind of see what they were right and wrong about, because they did have an idea he could be an airman, right?
Yes.
Or
Paul Holes had a theory that he had a plane actually.
Yes.
Because he committed a crime in the south of California and then was in the north the next day or something like that.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting.
But he was an army guy, I think.
Yeah, he had been in
and then a police officer.
Yeah.
Just so scary.
Yeah. I mean, they're the people you're there to serve and protect. So what case finally getting very excited about this question I have to ask you. What would be the case that you would love to see solved?
I have so many answers for
I know.
Irish-wise, I think we all want to see the Vanishing Triangle solved, all those ladies, definitely. A case that really annoys me and I feel like it's unsolved is the West Memphis 3.
Okay.
That's not solved to me.
Yeah.
That's just not solved. And then a classic is John Benet Ramsey.
Yes.
Like, why is that not solved?
Do you think it could be solved?
It's hard to know. You know when they hold evidence back because it's how they're going to identify the killer. I don't know if they have any of that. I don't know if we know about everything. Surely we didn't know everything about the Golden State Killer. We know that now. We don't even know the family member that they traced him back from, I don't think, in the Jed match. So like there's some things that you're never going to really know. Because also if you show all your cards, maybe that's bad for future cases. But I don't know. You listen to John Benet Ramsey, like there's so many of those podcasts. Like I feel like every crime podcast has an episode on John Benet. It's hard to know.
Yeah.
It's weird. Like some days I'm like, oh yeah, it was him. And then some days I'm like, oh no, I just don't want to say anybody's like, names or anything. But some days I think it's one person and then other days I'm like, that's not possible, I don't think.
Yeah.
I think you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah, I do. Yeah. Anyone who knows that case, anyone who knows true crime knows exactly what you're talking about. The pineapple, the bowl, you know, it's all. But John Ramsey, her father, was speaking at CrimeCon as well. And that was incredible. I was like, this is mad. John Ramsey is literally right there in front of me. But he was talking about how there is DNA and they do think that it is possible. So there you go. We never know. We might have an answer to John Benet Ramsey one day.
DNA.
Yeah.
It's over.
Exactly. That's another thing I spoke to Paul Holes about now. He was, you know, we were talking about how obviously in America they love their privacy, like love privacy. And we were saying like, well, just don't murder anyone then.
Yeah.
If you don't want to be convicted for murder.
That's what I say all the time.
Don't
be doing crimes.
Don't be doing crimes. Well, Janet Grogan, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
I'm Nicola Tallant and you're watching Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs and the underworld in Ireland and across the globe. Make sure you subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you can be the first to watch all our latest episodes. You can also listen wherever you get your podcasts.